We're here this afternoon with Wilbur Wright, class of 1961, and he's celebrating today his 50th year since graduating from SAIS, and it's April 14th, 2011. And I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, Wilbur, and to start,
yes.
I thought I would ask you, what brought you to SAIS? Give us your memory of that time.
As it happens, I've reflected on that story myself just in the last few days. Basically, I was recruited to SAIS, well, indirectly through Paul Linebarger. He was a close professional colleague and friend and associate of a woman named Marie Cole Berger, who was had been in the State Department and was a member of the United States UN delegation to the United Nations. She was the speaker for our United Nations Day celebration when I was in junior college in Highland Park, Michigan, Detroit, outside Detroit. And it was because of her interest in me. I was chairman of the student committee that was organizing the United Nations Day. And I picked her up at the train station. That's how people traveled in those days. And I escorted her around our campus and talked with her. And she asked me about myself and what my plans were. And I told her I was giving up architecture and was thinking of going into political science. She asked about my interest in international affairs. I said I had a great interest there. So that led to a correspondence with her. And she, in effect, became my mentor. And it was through her and through her relationship with Paul Linebarger that I was guided to SAIS.
Very good. So, in terms of your SAIS memories, I want to step back in time a little bit.
Yes.
And I want you to tell me a little bit about how it felt being here in the first year that you were here, what it was like, either the school itself or the political environment around the school.
But the school, of course, was quite different than it was located in the old buildings at 19th and Florida Avenue, which I found very charming. Very pleasing. I enjoyed that environment. I, of course, was married at the time. I had completed my studies at the University of Michigan and had done a number of things afterward. I went back to Michigan to do some further study in economics. I decided I did not want to pursue that course and went to work for the federal government as a claims examiner for the Social Security Administration so that I could accumulate the money that I thought would be necessary to attend SAIS. While all of this was going on, the start, stop, change, shift, I was continuing this correspondence with Marie Cole Berger, and she in liaison with Paul Linebarger. So there was always in the background the idea that I would come to SAIS. I completed changed that. I went to work as a claims examiner, and then I got my acceptance from SAIS. I still didn't have very much money, and I was thinking of getting married. So I thought that the Congress in its wisdom would pass the general GI Bill, and that would make it possible for me to attend school more comfortably. So I elected to go into the military service. As it happens, the Congress didn't pass the GI Bill while I was in the service. They passed it after I graduated from SAIS. So there was no help. But I was older than most of the other students because I had spent that extra time after graduation at the University of Michigan pursuing some further economics. Then, because I worked for the Social Security Administration as a claims examiner, and also because I had spent 2 years as a draftee in the American Army. Interestingly and fortunately for me, in Japan, which broadened my views and experience.
And in terms of just being at SAIS, one vivid memory perhaps that comes to mind?
Yes, I didn't spend a lot of time at the school, except in the evening at study. And so I came to school, class, study, then I went back home. My wife was an elementary teacher in the District of Columbia, and so we both were very busy. So we seized whatever time we had together. Despite that, though, I became fairly close to several students, some of whom were in the same curriculum I was in, that is the Near East Area Studies. Tim Childs, the late Tim Childs, and I became good friends, which was kind of surprising to some people because we came from such different backgrounds. But we were both leaders in the Middle Eastern program. But aside from that, somehow our way of thinking and approaching problems coincided, so we became great friends. And and Tim was also married, so because of that, we saw more of each other after school. Tom Fyror was also in the Near East program, and he was also married, had an apartment downtown, and we also became good friends with Tom and Eve, who were both still living, although they moved to West Virginia.
So in terms of SAIS and the graduate education that you were able to participate in while you were here, how is that sort of, how did that shift into your life's professional work?
Foreign affairs was a recurring theme that I kept returning to. I, from time to time, would become interested in some other alternative career, but it lasted briefly, and then I would return to the idea of international affairs. And the central component of that idea was attending SAIS. Most of the students, going back to your earlier question, most of the students at that time were just fresh out of undergraduate school and single, and then that led to a somewhat divergent approach to life. I was focused on the idea of going back to work and starting a family at some early point. The program, the Near East program, and the faculty we had at that time made it, well, helped and facilitated my approach to life at that time. We formed a good relationship with Professor Kaduri, who was head of the program at that time, and Paul, that's his son, Professor Eli Salim. It's not central to your purpose, but because of an event that's going to occur later this evening, it's interesting to me that we became good friends with Professor Salem and his wife. He invited us to a lawn party, and there I met a man whose last name I'm having some difficulty remembering, but who was the curator of the Phillips Gallery. And I had served in the American Army in Yokohama. There I had met, become close friends with a fellow who was company clerk, who it turned out had settled in Washington just the year after I moved here. But he was an artist. But because Jim and Nancy were affiliated with the Phillips Gallery, I introduced them. And that led to a very close relationship that led to Sam Gilliam's now international fame as an artist, abstract artist. He's being honored this evening at the Meridian House.
Wow! What a
but these
the timing and the coincidence,
yes,
and the
interrelationships that.
How wonderful! That's amazing.
But getting back to my own time at SAIS, it was a very pleasant time. I was full of anxiety because I'd been out of academic life for so long.
Yeah.
So I was more than a little concerned about
And the political climate was very interesting in the early 60s.
Yes, it was quite dynamic. That was a source of great entertainment. Most of the students, it seemed to me, or a good many of the students with whom I came in contact, had come out of Ivy League schools. And in a sense, my background from the University of Michigan was different. I discovered also that many of the students had never worked. They'd never been employed anywhere. Well, I had worked all the way through school, including high school. But some of them found that fascinating because they'd never they never had a chance to sit down and talk to someone who had actually done physical work. So they wanted to know, especially about my experience working in the assembly plants in Detroit, my hometown. And I found it fascinating that people didn't know about this, had no idea what it was like to have to get up at a particular hour in the morning and make sure with public transportation you could get to a factory and to find your place in that plant and perform a certain task. If you think about it, it's obvious. No one would know about this if they had no experience with it.
In so many ways, you were providing a value added to their education.
For some of them, yes.
For some of them.
Yeah, I found it rather entertaining and astonishing. We had a lounge that was really conducive to this kind of contact at the old school. It was like an old London men's club, with green leather furniture and the fireplace and the mahogany paneled walls. And of course, I carried my lunch every day, so I sat in the lounge and ate lunch, and we had vigorous exchanges about the importance of labor. Of course, Barry Goldwater's career was just taking off then, and many of these guys had read Ayn Rand and were great enthusiasts for the idea of, for example, abandoning Social Security. Well, I had just spent 2 years as a Social Security claims examiner and trainee, and was really quite steeped in the whole system, the philosophy of it. They had an amazing training program that was useful to me later in my Foreign Service career. But it also meant that I brought a point of view that hadn't been a part of the background of many of the other students at SAIS. The idea that working people make a contribution that is unusual and is entitled to a particular kind of reward. And that since we had moved out of an agrarian society, which subsistence agriculture really, in a sense, provided its own safety net, and having moved out of that into an industrial society and a commercial society emerging too, there was a necessity for something like a Social Security system. And some of them, I think, for the first time in their lives, gave serious consideration to why we had them. They're also intrigued to learn something that I had been taught in the program, that the first Social Security system in the world was founded by the great Count Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Prussia, and later the German Republic. not the Republic,
Weimar.
No, before Weimar. But because he fostered the unification of Germany after fighting the Franco-Prussian War.
Of course.
That I learned about in SAIS.
Wow. I do think about, I can't help, I usually don't talk during these interviews, but the mix and the complexity of people coming together creates that environment that is rich. And the exchange that you talked about at the lounge of the Florida Avenue is where I guess it really took place.
Yes, exactly.
That's wonderful. Tell me about Cairo.
Well, of course, SAIS was central to my getting the Cairo assignment, because I didn't go into the Foreign Service through the standard exam route. I was what they call a lateral entry, because from SAIS I went to the U.S. Department of Labor as an international relations officer, where I worked on Middle East. I was the backup for the guy who was responsible for Middle East in the International Bureau. But I worked primarily on international trade union affairs, particularly the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was the Communist International at that time. Through a fascinating concatenation of events and misadventures, it was the Department of Labor proposed to the State Department to reestablish the position of labor attaché at the embassy in Cairo. And there's an interesting story that we probably don't have time for as to how the position, which had once been there, an important position, had been abolished. But as a result of the Cleopatra incident in New York, Secretary of Labor Arthur Goldberg suggested to Secretary Dean Rusk, that it might be useful to recreate this position of a labor attaché in Cairo to avoid crises that had been precipitated by this thing called the Cleopatra incident in New York. And out of that, Secretary Rusk had asked Goldberg, well, send over some names of people, and I'll talk to my people about it. Well, the Labor Department sent over my name, and that's how I became. Now, there were several reasons for nominating me. One was that I had studied Arabic and had this background in Islam and the Middle East from SAIS. Secondly, I had background as a Social Security claims examiner in the study of labor economics at Michigan. So, and then I had 3 years in the International Bureau of the Labor Department. So altogether, these combined to suggest that I might be a good candidate for the job. As it turned out, some fascinating things happened. I'm not sure how much time we have. In the position of International Relations Officer in the International Bureau of the Labor Department, I had been introduced to virtually all of the labor leaders from the Near East who visited the United States. And over that 3-year period, practically every significant labor leader from the whole Middle East at some time passed through Washington. So when I went to Cairo, I already had met all of the key figures. The Minister of Labor, in fact, I had met him when he was still head of the Confederation of Labor. He later was elevated to the Minister of Labor. The President of the Confederation of Labor, head of the Petroleum Workers Union, the Executive Director of International Affairs for the Federation of Labor. So this is just a sketch of the many people I already knew. So when I arrived, it was really almost like a reunion. Now the president of the Egyptian Confederation of Labor, a man named Ahmed Fahim, had 2 jobs. In addition to being head of the Confederation of Labor, he was also vice chairman of vice president, I should say, of the Egyptian parliament, unicameral parliament. They had 1 president of the parliament and 2 vice presidents. As it happened, when I arrived in Cairo, Ambassador Badeau, who had been there, had left maybe a month before, so there was a vacancy. The deputy chief of mission, and his name doesn't come to me right now, was preparing to transfer out. So he was primarily packing up at home and so forth. He wasn't there very much. The political counselor, Don Burgess, had had a health crisis and had been medically evacuated to the United States. The 4th political officer was on his standard home leave, so there was just 1 man in the political section in Cairo when I arrived. And there was coming up that summer of 1964 the Non-Aligned Summit, which was called Bandung II. There had previously been the meeting of all the non-aligned leaders in Bandung, Indonesia, and now President Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt sought to present himself as a key figure in the Third World. And so he had organized the Bandung II in Cairo. So there was that summit conference, and there was going to be an African summit, there was going to be an Arab summit, and an Islamic summit. And in fact, we had now, at that moment anyway, just 1 political officer plus a newly arrived novice. Wilbur Wright.
Well, that was an exciting time, no question. You were in the thick of political change extraordinaire. So let me ask if you have advice, if you could offer advice to today's students, what would it be?
It would be to develop as broad a background as you can. Obviously, in those days, SAIS had the area studies program, so the focus was fairly specific and some might say even narrow, in that in the Middle East program, for example, we studied Arabic and and Islam and all of its manifestations, and then the history of the area. But in studying, of course, giving adequate, full study of a geographic area, inevitably you cover world history, because you can't discuss the many manifestations of political change in the Middle East without relating it to what was going on in Russia and Western Europe, the United States, and so on. So with the discipline that comes from the study program here, I think it's useful to also develop some knowledge about something else. It could be computers, it could be labor economics, it could be women's affairs. But it's useful to have at least two specialties, so to speak.
So you anchor that broad-based understanding in something very specific, is what you're saying.
Yes.
And you become an expert in that area.
In that field, yes. Doesn't mean you necessarily that will be your career, your total career, because as things evolved for me, with the 1967 war, everything changed. And I found myself in Italian language studies and a commercial officer in Rome. So then I had two axes for my career. Yeah. Getting back to Cairo, there's one other thing that happened. It's kind of interesting. I mentioned Ahmed Fahim was vice president of the Confederation of Labor. There was the other vice president of the parliament was a man named Syed Mareh. Now he had been a friend of a Professor Morrow Berger from Princeton University, and as fate would have it, Morrow Berger visited the embassy in Cairo that summer, and he wanted to talk to somebody about his experience of traveling through the area and also get the embassy's reading on what was going on in Cairo. Well, the only person available to talk to him was Wilbur Wright. So we had a chat in the office, and as it happened, he arrived shortly before lunchtime. So I took him home for lunch, and we had an extended conversation, at the end of which he said, you know, I really appreciated this and the chance to sit down in a home and have a meal, because I've been eating in hotel restaurants for so long. I wish I had something to give you, but I don't, except I can give you a name. And the name he gave me said it was the name of the only person who had been active politically before the Naguib Nasser revolution in Egypt, who was still active. And that was a man named Syed Mareh, who was the other vice president of the parliament. Now, so in effect I knew now two of the vice presidents. In October, I'll try to go through this quickly so it won't take up too much time. In October of '64, an unarmed American transport plane owned by an oil company was shot down by Egyptian fighter jets over the Delta. There was no apology. The Egyptians did not allow American access to the crash site. They didn't turn over the bodies. That was in October. Thanksgiving Day, November, a mob attacked the embassy compound. The embassy at that time consisted of, I think, 5 or 6 buildings, 2 of which were burned to the ground. One was the USA Library, the other was the Marine House. It was alleged that the mob consisted of Congolese students who had attacked the embassy in anger over something called the Stanleyville Drop, that is American Air Force planes transporting Belgian paratroopers to Stanleyville in the Congo to rescue nuns. The truth of that is disputed, but in any case, the host government has responsibility for protection of diplomatic property, and they had failed to do that adequately, so that the Marine House burned to the ground, nothing left. They burned down the library. The first, incidentally, the first USIS library overseas, and they burned it and all of its collection. Then in December, President Nasser went to Port Said for what they called Evacuation Day, the day that the last troops from Britain, France, and Israel had withdrawn after the invasion in 1956. And there he made a speech. Now, this is rather awkward because the British, French, and Israelis had withdrawn from Egypt under pressure from President Eisenhower. So the Americans had taken the lead in liberating, in effect, Egypt. So when President Nasser went to Port Said, the last point from which these troops had left Egypt, and made a speech attacking the United States, accusing the United States of having threatened to refuse any further grain assistance to Egypt unless they submitted to our every demand. It was annoying. So, those three events, background. Incidentally, we had not received an apology for the burning of the library and the Marine House, and no offer of compensation. So, January, I got around finally to taking up this contact that Professor Berger had given me. So I called on Said Mareh. He had two jobs also. In addition to being Vice President of Parliament, he was the head of the Central Bank of Egypt at that time. So I called on him there and asked him to give me some insight into how the Parliament worked. What were the basic procedures? What was the committee structure? Because there was no printed material on it anywhere. He listened to my questions and my sketch of the background and giving him some of my own background. Then, without any further introduction or response to what I had been saying, he said, "What do we have to do to get a new wheat agreement?" Now, they had had a 3-year wheat agreement, something that had been started by President Kennedy. There had been protests in the Third World that these 6 months and 1 year agreements kept the countries on too short a string, and that led to diplomats using it as a carrot, as a stick in the relationship, and the food shouldn't be used as a weapon in international relations. So Kennedy had introduced the idea of a long-term agreement, and the 3-year agreement we have with Egypt had just expired. So this man asked me, "What do we have to do to get a new wheat agreement?" That's a very important, very interesting question. But I think some elements of this situation are obvious. You attacked unarmed American plane, you burned our buildings down, and then insulted us on international radio. So specifically, what do we have to do? I have no brief to discuss that. That's something I'm sure that we can arrange someone at an appropriate level to discuss with you, but I'm not the person. He insisted. I said, "Well, look, I have opinions about this, because I've been here and I've seen what's happened, but I can't, give you a prescription for how to resume food support to Egypt." He said, "What do we have to?" I said, I'll give you my opinion. If you will then allow us to go forward with the discussion of how the Parliament works and what's going on there." He nodded. I took it as an assent. He said, "One, the bagasse factory up at Edfu, I visited the factory up there. It's an American gift of new technology to Egypt on how to process sugarcane pulp into paper. You have no paper making capability in the country. This is something I see that's given to you. And our engineers are marooned up there because nobody from your Ministry of Industry has come to accept title to the company. And for that simple bureaucratic matter, our engineers are in fact hostage up there. So what do we need to do?" I said, "Well, the president ought to go up there and accept title to the company, congratulate our engineers for a brilliant job well done, and thank us bountifully for it." And he said, "And what else?" I said, "Well, you shot down our plane. We need access to the site. You need to turn over the planes. You need to apologize for having shot down the plane." He said, "What else?" And he started writing these things down. I said, "This is not something this is just my opinion. This is not, I can't negotiate for the United States." He says, "What else? What else?" I said, "Well, you burned down our library. It was the first USIS overseas library in the world. So as it happens, our whole complex is in Garden City. We count at least 16 mansions within 2 blocks of the embassy, which make really very good libraries. So it would be something, there's a quick solution to that. So one, you owe us an apology for the shooting out of the plane, apology for attack on the embassy. You ought to apologize for burning down the Marine House and then offer, obviously, compensation in all these cases. And you should, as a quick solution, my idea would be to give us one of those mansions. And then the president ought to be there for the transfer of title to the property, and he ought to, you know, make sure that they have a good collection of Egyptian books to go in the library. He says, what else? So I said, these are just ideas on what needs to be done. But he says, thank you. I said, now let's talk about the Parliament. And instead he stood up, gave me his hand, so I shook his hand, he pulled me to my feet and started walking to the door. So I'm going along with him, but you know, we're going to go to another room to talk about the Parliament. He got to the door, he opened it, and he says to me, I will report your conditions to the president. I said, wait, dude, this has no standing. This is no status. I have no brief, no commission from the U.S. government to negotiate this. He says, thank you. I'll report these to the president. So I went straight to the embassy, of course, and called down Burgess and told him, who then in turn, after hearing a recitation of the conversation, called the ambassador, Battle, who had arrived in the interim, to come over to the embassy, and he cheerfully strolled into the embassy on a Sunday afternoon. Well, Don, what have we got now? Well, we're telling what you just told me. And he says, and then what did he say? And then what did you say? And the frowns got deeper and deeper. And then what did he say? What did you say? And what else did you tell him? What did you ask for? How did this happen? So, at the end, Battle says to Burgess, does this guy actually have access to President Nasser? He said, yeah, I think he does. So, you think he's going to do that? I mean, it sounds like it. Is there any way we can find out about this? He says, well, the economic counselor at the embassy can perhaps give us some idea. But he hasn't had really much interaction. He talks to the Ministry of Industry and the Ministry of Finance and so forth, but he hasn't had much action with the central bank. In fact, generally, we haven't had much contact, as it happens in recent years, with the central bank. We know the man because we see him at various functions. And so, well, what did we do? So we reported it to Washington, and Marais called me to say that he will let me know what's going to happen. That was Sunday. On Tuesday, he called and says, I have good news. Come over. So I went over to his office, and he greeted me at the door with a big smile on his face and an abbraccio, which before we had had a very cordial, distant handshake. And he stepped into the office, he closed the door and says, the president accepts your conditions. Wait.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Wow.
These are not my...
You were serving as the Secretary of the State at the time. What a story. What an amazing story.
Out of that came something that helped but also hurt us in a sense, because people in Washington couldn't, of course, reverse direction that quickly. The media had made such a point out of the American-Egyptian relations being at a nadir, the worst possible low point in all of history, with this long list of events. And despite the fact that the Egyptians began immediately, we got apologies that same day for both the aircraft incident and for the burning down of the building. And they offered to compensation for the buildings, and offered, incidentally, to show us the mansions that we might find appropriate in Garden City to become a library.
Congratulations. That is history. That is history being made. This is a wonderful interview. I want to thank you. A great story. An insight into politics unlike I've ever heard. And so, thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you. It's the interpersonal relations. I mentioned that I met all these people before, so I arrived.
It's all about personal relations.
Yes.
Absolutely. And they couldn't have had a better person at the U.S. Embassy than you, Wilbur. Thank you so much. This
Thank you.
concludes our interview for today. Thank you.
Thank you.